Hey, how's everybody doing? Checking in. I want to knock this video out for you. I am, I never, since I'm in my office at home, I know how to do this. So I got all these screens, man, and I don't know where I'm looking. Um, but I don't know. I'm just going to look straight, I guess. But my reading is over here that I want y'all to take a look at. Um, I don't know. I'll figure it out. But look, man, how y'all doing? Y'all all right? Let me get my reading up. What I want to, obviously talk about today. For about 20, 30 minutes, you've read, or hopefully you would have read the piece from your emails on and Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. It's about three different short articles going back and forth in verbal assault with one another, right? Kind of reminiscent of what's going on now, right? With Kendrick and Drake and Metro Boomin and J. Cole and stuff. But Du Bois, right? Du Bois, right? He was, born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, right? We did all that stuff early in the semester. So let's kind of jump into this debate, right? So, Du Bois, we know, was an activist, right? And one of the nation's towering individuals at the time. Historically, one of the greatest to ever do it. In 1905, right, he helped to found the Niagara Movement, which later became, in 1910, the NAACP, um, which, Kaylee, no, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, right? Um, he never really held an executive, well, yeah, executive office. He was never like president or vice president like that. He was the editor of their magazine, The Crisis, right? And so that's an important distinction, like between him um, and Garvey, because Garvey founds, the United Negro Improvement Association, and was the head of it, um, and so a different type of dynamic, right? Although, the story is that Garvey, who met Du Bois already in Jamaica, came to New York expecting that, connect with Du Bois, do some good work, free some black folk, from intellectual and mental and social struggle. And he got an ally, felt he had an ally in Du Bois, right? Um, but through history, we know there's this long standing, um, got personal, right? But certainly political beef and antagonism between Du Bois and Garvey, right? And it lasted a while, quite frankly, very quick, kind of, not quite nuanced, but maybe enough for this conversation. The ideological debates kind of gathered around sort of separatism versus sort of a form of integrationism or belief in America that Du Bois had, and a sort of wanting to go back to Africa, right? As far as Garvey is concerned, right? But it also was this question of Du Bois as being an elite brother, right? As sort of a highbrow Negro, if you will, and Garvey kind of representing this sort of everyday working class kind of black person, right? But like I always tell people that makes some sense, right? Sorry, that makes some sense, but the reality is, you know, I mean, Garvey was a capitalist too, right? And irony is, Du Bois really was a Marxist, right? So I don't know. It's kind of hard to use those staunch distinctions, but in their lifetimes, they both kind of held on to some sort of a part of some type of economic nationalism anyway, self-sufficiency, self-determination kind of thing. They both were engaged in Pan-Africanist ideas as well as Pan-African endeavors, and they both loved them some black folk, right, and tried to enrich the cultural heritage, right. So I tell the story how I learned it from when I was in school with Dr. West. You know, there is the movie Do the Right Thing, right, and in the movie, um, I think the character Giancarlo Esposito, he goes into Sal's pizzeria, orders some pizza right in the middle of the hood in Harlem where they were at, or Brooklyn where they were at, and he notices all these Italian folk on the wall, right? And he says, Yo Sal, how come it ain't no brothers on the wall?" And the character gets all indignant or whatever. But I raise that because, quite frankly, like Garvey asked that of Du Bois, right? Garvey had invited Du Bois to some event when he came to New York. Um, it was a speech that Garvey was doing. Again, Garvey expected them to, kick it off, jump it off, do some good work together, collaborative work. And Du Bois told his secretary, "Tell him, nah, I'm busy. I can't make it." The words of young folks. He spent them. You know what I'm saying? And Garvey was like, "Hold on." So Garvey shows up to the office of the crisis, right? And as the story goes, he looked around, um, and the crisis office, and he was like dude in the movie, like, "Yo, Sal." He was like, "Yo, Du Bois, like, how come ain't no brothers on the wall?" He had all these, you know, white and European folk on the wall, and but the Du Bois, but remember, the crisis was mainly white, the NAACP was mainly white, and there's a lot of different reasons, but let's just say practically reasoning, the NAACP itself was a mixed race founding, right? And there was no such thing as, especially right there in 1910, as a black publishing company, right? Um, so I don't make no excuses, but it's just what it is. But I guess he had to have all them folk on the wall. But that was Garvey's critique. Let me keep moving. So Garvey's critique was that. So he jumps in like, and Garvey kind of, let me lock that into my mental Rolodex, that he go this great Du Bois, leader of black folk, fighter of civil rights, freedom fighter, blah, blah, blah. He out here got all the white folk on his wall, you know what I'm saying? So Garvey wouldn't forget that, trust me. And in the reading, if you've read already, you saw how he questioned it. But one of the first things that was problematic, so the first thing was ideological. Then it was economic, right? In terms of their beef, right? And Du Bois was sort of critical of, you know, Garvey's Black Star Line, which was the ship, the ships that he was buying to take people back to Africa from America and the West Indies. According to to some of the history books, he raised over $600,000 to purchase these ships. And later on, we know that he ends up getting into some political, some legal trouble. Some argue because of people like Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson and Booker T. But certainly the fact that they had beef didn't help, right? However, he got caught up with the feds, right? Um, and he wasn't quite too changed. But I'll be fresh as egg with the feds watching, right? He wasn't fresh. He got caught up, you know. But again, let me move on. Du Bois referred to him, and I want to get to the reading a little bit, as the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race, right? And he called him a lunatic. Let's actually get to the reading real quickly. So I'm not going to do this long. I just want to kind of make reference to it. If you go to, actually, let's go back to the point that I was making about Rick Ross and Drake. So if you go to page 262 in the reading, if anybody else sees this on YouTube or whatever, if you want this article, these articles, just email me and I will send you these articles, these readings that my students are reading. But in 1923, Du Bois, or Marcus Garvey writes from W.E.B. Du Bois as a hater of dark people, right? And watch this. He says that Du Bois calls his own race black and ugly, judging from the white man's standard of beauty. He says this is the trick of the National Association and Advancement of Colored People to solve a problem by assimilation and color distinction, right? So then he's already laying it out there. He said, man, don't trust this cat. Don't trust him because he ain't fully black, not like us, right? Du Bois, we know, had white parentage on both sides, right? And actually, interesting thing about this reading, right? Garvey says W.E. He didn't say B. He said W.E. Burkhart Du Bois. Shots fired, right? Let me lay it out here. Brothers and sisters, this Negro leader y'all got two French names. How many homies in the hood you know got a name like Burkhart and Du Bois? Let's keep it real. So you want people to know he's a fraud already, right? So he says W.E. Burkhart Du Bois, the Negro misleader, who is also editor of the Crisis, the official organ of the NAACP, gave the address and everything. He has again appeared in print, trying to, or they say in hip hop, he put something together and leaked. So let me get him back. This time he appears in an author of an article in the February issue under the caption "Back to Africa," which he makes the effort to criticize, right, the Black Star Line and the Negro Improvement Association, United Negro Improvement Association. Watch this. Having bold and blacks, fat, black, ugly man. In describing, now when we read it, he's like, who's writing this? Marcus Garvey's writing this, but he wrote himself in third person for whatever reason. But Marcus Garvey writes, in describing Marcus Garvey, me, in the article before mentioned, he referred to me as a little fat black man, ugly, with intelligent eyes and a big head. Now, what does Du Bois mean by ugly? This so called professor of Harvard and Berlin ought to know by now that the standard of beauty within a race is not arrived at by comparison with other races, as for instance, if he were to desire to find out the standard of beauty among Japanese people, we would not judge them from an Anglo Saxon viewpoint, but from the Japanese. So, how he arrived at the conclusion that me, Marcus Garvey, is ugly, being a Negro, is impossible to determine, in that if there was any ugliness in the Negro race, it would be reflected more through Du Bois than through me, Marcus Garvey, in that he himself tells us that he is a little Dutch, a little French, and a little Negro. So, why, in fact, the man is such a monstrosity? So if there's any ugliness, it is in the part of Du Bois, and not on the part of this who you call a little fat black man. Bang! Right? Marcus like, hold on. Who you calling like Queen Latifah, who you calling to be, right? Who you out here trying to do this on? Don't make me clap back. And he clapped back. Right? So this is the beef that we got going on, right? And so in essence, right, what we're trying to say, he says he's describing back and a misleader of people, right? But because he called him, so in essence, right, we're looking at, and again, Du Bois. Let me go to Du Bois's piece that prompted this, right? Hold on, let's get that. So that was 1923. Du Bois in 19. No, that's let's look at first in 21. 21, right? Let's give another shots fired at Du Bois and NAACP, right? Marcus Garvey says in 21, he says that these folks in the NAACP trying to, basically trying to challenge us at the Black Star Line and UNIA. He says, now watch this. He says, as we study the personality of Dr. Du Bois, we find that he only appreciates one type of man, and that is the cultured, refined type which lingers around universities and attend pink tea affairs. The men of dynamic force of the Negro race, the men with the ability to sway and move the masses. Dr. Du Bois can appraise their face value, and that is why the author of the so-called Souls of Black Folk, while the idol of the dark room aristocrats, could not thus far become a popular leader of the masses of his own race. Right? Bang. You comfortable around them white folk at Harvard, which Du Bois wasn't, but this was his retort. Right? You come around them white folk at Harvard. You come around them white people who you writing the souls of black folk to. You remember the opening line of Souls of Black Folk, right? Oh, gentle reader, receive this book and all its foibles, kind of stuff. Who was a gentle reader? White folk, right? So Garvey, like I said, Garvey got some political jabs. I mean, some rhetorical jabs, right? And it's interesting because he goes in this article, and talks about the crisis and being, funded by white folk and only highbrow Negroes and not the common day folk and all this, start naming all these of political and social fat cats, right? That Du Bois is down with, right? But it's just interesting, right? But now watch this. So Du Bois, this point I was about to say, let me move a little faster. So Du Bois comes and says this. He says, "Is Marcus Garvey a lunatic or a traitor?" Right. He says, in its endeavor to avoid any injustice toward Marcus Garvey and his followers, the crisis has almost leaned backwards, notwithstanding his wanton squandering of hundreds of thousands of dollars, which he has refused to assume that he was a common thief. Shot. I ain't gonna talk about the fact that you stealing money from black folk. I ain't gonna talk about that. He says, I ain't gonna talk about the fact that you've been consistently and persistently lying to white folk and to black folk through your propaganda. I ain't gonna go there either. And we at the crisis, we ain't even touching on none of that. Right? It's what he says. In the face, however, of the unbelievable depths of debasement and humiliation to which this demagogue has descended in order to keep himself out of jail, it, it is our duty at the crisis to say openly and clearly Marcus Garvey is, without a doubt, the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and the world. Bang. Right? He is either a lunatic or a traitor. I mean, these folk ain't playing with each other, man. They just ain't playing, right? And so, for me, I just thought this was important you to read that kind of back and forth a little bit, and let's kind of wrap this up in terms of what makes their ideological differences, their personal differences, their financial questions, blah blah blah. But let's get this right. Those are personal attacks, right? But the reality was Du Bois. He was pro-Africa, right? I mean, he visited Africa in the 1920s. Obviously, we know in what 54, after the President Nkrumah in Ghana was inaugurated, he ended up moving to Africa, and then that's where he died, right? Uh, and he was. There's a quote. Hold on. There's a quote. Let me find that quote. In terms of his own relative Pan Africanism, right? Where's that quote by Garvey in 1920s? That's why Garvey. I mean, Du Bois looking at Garvey like, dude, check my receipts, man. I've been fighting on black folk. I'm fighting for Pan Africanism. All this, you just out here stealing money. That's what you doing. You fat, ugly, black, big nose. They wild though. But look, Du Bois says Negroes are to lead in the rise of Africa. Period. Negroes are to lead in the rise of Africa, or whether they must always and everywhere follow the guidance of white folk. So right there, you can get with this, you can get with that, right? We gonna lead in the Pan Africanist movement, or we gonna continue to follow the leadership and guidance of white people. That's Du Bois talking, and he organized what the first Pan African Congress, right? Around this 1920, 1919, 1921. I forgot the year. Sorry, but it happened. I think it was 21 because he had to get in 23 and another year. But if he was an assimilationist, according to Garvey, and he kept moving left politically, though, right? He was eventually we know him as a Marxist on the economic side, right? And he advocated for, in his own words, a nation within a nation, um, especially around the Great Depression. Um, I don't know. I mean, I think you know one of the things that we can say about this little debate um, was Garvey was kind of attack him as being an elite brother, right? A highbrow dude, not down with the common folk. What maybe I hate this comparison, but maybe be considered respectability, the politics of respectability. Du Bois was talking about what? Identifying the best and brightest of black folk, right? Talented 10th, high black citizenry, right? So that white America can see black excellence, the gifts of black folk. Now, one question I was asked in class today, I want to thank those who did come to class in spite of it was optional. We did have a good, robust conversation of about about 4 or 5 of us. Um, that was a conversation around is Du Bois doing this for white approval? And that's tough. I mean, he certainly wanted to represent the best of black folk in an effort, right, to um, raise our consciousness, right, and to raise our level of representation, and to see what leadership looks like. But it was in an effort to prove to white folk that black people have a place in this society at the highest of all levels. Now, on the flip side, you got Marcus Garvey, right? Garvey comes through from Jamaica, right? British um, colony, right? And Garvey just don't think that white folk gonna accept black people no matter who you put in front of them. If they found out Jesus was black, there's about get him too, right? So Garvey starts with a different position. I don't think there's nothing you can do, Du Bois, and to get white people to accept black folk. And so that's why he said we should return to Africa, right? And that we can be the majority population, have more political power, which Du Bois claims he wants, but in America is always a minority. Garvey says we go to Africa, we'll be a majority in political power. Now, of course, what Du Bois is saying, dude, this is why you're a lunatic. Because you're talking about an imperialist, a continent that's been divided up by British imperialism and French imperialism and Spanish imperialism. What are you talking about, dude? Yeah, we have mass number of people, but we ain't got no power. We gotta fight fire. We gotta engage in political activity to get power, not just by numbers. But Garvey had his argument. He sold people on it. He bought his ships, the Black Star Line, right? Sold stocks to it and shares to it and subscriptions with the United Negro Improvement Association. Urged black folk to fight for themselves and work for themselves and support each other, blah blah blah, and stay away from white folk. Stay away from them. But later on, we'll see Washington picks up a little bit of that, even though Washington and Garvey didn't get along either. And it is Booker T. Washington, right? He didn't get along with Garvey either, but they have a same similar line against Du Bois. Stop trying to integrate within society politically and socially, economically, and just do for yourself kind of stuff, right? But in essence, Du Bois sort of will always be sort of seen as a civil rights groundbreaker, right? Trailblazer, right? Um, and you know, it's hard to take away from that, right? So yeah, even though he was the most dangerous Negro, even though Du Bois criticized Garvey as being the most dangerous Negro in the Negro race, let's kind of sum it up and get out the door. Um, because you got to read and you got to do, and then we'll recap after you read. Du Bois thought Garvey was dangerous for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, we talked about ideological, right? The sort of the differences of what empowerment and progress looks like, right? This idea of self advocacy and self determination, black pride, they both believed in, but Garvey was, obviously more of a separatist, and they just saw. I think they definitely saw the solutions being different, going back to Africa or staying in America. But they also saw the problem as being something different, right? Garvey didn't give up on white folk, especially at this time in the 1920s. He didn't give up on white people. He didn't give up on America at this time. He ended up giving up on them, but in 20s he did. He didn't give up to 54, right? So obviously the money, right? Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, focusing on black businesses and economic empowerment and stuff like that. Created the shipping company, Black Star Line, right? And created some businesses. And Du Bois, and partly because why him and James Weldon Johnson and Booker T. Washington and others arguably tricked on him to the feds. But Du Bois just was like, man, you misdirect the funds, you stealing money, you ain't taking care of the business right. We about to expose you for the fraud that you are, right? He also thought Garvey was a little bit. He just talked a lot, right? And he, kind of like I don't want to use that example, but he just basically had a lot of stuff that riled up the people, but had no plan that actually can move them from just being upset to being different. I mean, I give this example. Religiously speaking, it's like the preacher that gets you in a frenzy, get you shouting, get you jumping. You done ran through the church all day long, want out for Jesus, but the church has no plan for economic empowerment, have no plan for food and shelter, has no plan for counseling, or they just want to shout as many days as they can do. Again, no disrespect to folk who like shouting churches, but if you ain't If you hollering on Sunday and laid out at the altar, and Monday you don't operate toward fixing it, you back the next Sunday with the same issues. Because what happened Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday was nothing. All you had was shout. That's what Dubois was saying Garvey was. All he was emotional rhetoric. Shouts, get people all excited, making promises, misleading poor folk and more folk, poor black folk. He says, I'm the voice of reason. I will get you into a situation. Just follow me. I'm arguing for justice. I'm arguing for engagement in society, and, involvement in society and respect in society. Du Bois is appealing to your emotions. I mean, Garvey's appealing to your emotions. I'm trying to appeal to your rationality. That's why he called him a fraud, a demagogue, right? They just didn't like each other. They real talk. Last thing, and this beef got personal. Thank God they didn't shoot each other, But this beef got personal, you know. I don't know which one was Tupac, which was Biddy, but he hit him up. You know what I'm saying? But they were fighting for influence, fighting for authority, fighting for respect, and but there was some real dislike among each other, right? Um, and but they both were, great organizers, strong activists, right? Um, Du Bois obviously was the leading intellectual, you know, challenging white supremacism in the way that he could through empirical evidence and recent argumentation. And Garvey, was a showman, riling them up. And, he even created a sort of a African government, considered himself the king or the president of an African government, wore all the garb and all that kind of stuff, right? Um, it's interesting, right? But now, don't get me wrong, Du Bois caught a case too now. Du Bois caught him a Fed case. He got out of his, though. Garvey didn't get out of his, but Du Bois got out of his. Um, but the last thing I'll say before I hang up is that, one thing Garvey was sort of really engaged in racial purity, right? Which we said before, Du Bois really couldn't, partly because of his parentage. And if you remember the language of the article we read about miscegenation, Garvey, Du Bois was saying, look, you just can't legislate black and white folks sleeping with each other. They're going to do what they're going to do. Now, obviously, part of that, we talked about in class today, part of that, he couldn't help but say that because both his mother's side and daddy's side got his paternal great grandfather was white, and his maternal grandfather was white. What are you supposed to say, right? So I don't know. It's just interesting, man. I really hope you enjoyed this reading. I hope you enjoyed the little video, and I'm gonna do a next one on after we start reading Du Bois and Washington, but Booker T too. So take care.